the 7th of December, 1941. Terminal Island, California. The fog off the Los Angeles harbor is cold, but the news spreading through the fishing community is colder. Radios crackle with reports from Hawaii, a place thousands of miles away but tied by blood and heritage to the families here. Men who left at dawn in their tuna boats, the Times Fooders, Times on their hulls bearing names like Times Amagi Times or Times Congo *, are now seen as the vanguard of an invasion. By afternoon, FBI agents are walking the docks, lists in hand, arresting community leaders, priests, and language teachers. For the Nisei, the second generation, born in American hospitals, who pledge allegiance to the American flag, the day ends not just in national shock, but in a devastating personal bewilderment. They are Americans. But in an instant, their neighbors' eyes, the eyes of the country they call home, have become filled with suspicion. This is not a story of a battle won or lost with bullets and steel, not at its start. This is the story of a war fought for identity, for the right to bleed for a nation that had branded them as the enemy within. The saga of the 442nd Regiment is more than a tale of battlefield valor. It is the central paradox of America's Second World War. It is the story of how a group of men, dispossessed, interned, and stripped of their rights by their own government, responded not with righteous fury, but with a disciplined, desperate courage, ultimately becoming the most decorated military unit for its size and service in the entire history of the United States Armed Forces. Theirs was a war fought on two fronts, one against the Axis in Europe, and another, quieter, more painful war against the hysteria and prejudice of their homeland. The engine of this domestic war was fear, and its architect was Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, Chief of the Western Defense Command. DeWitt was a man who saw the West Coast not as a home to citizens, but as a potential fifth column. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, he became the loudest voice advocating for the mass removal of all Japanese Americans. His arguments, presented to the War Department, were not based on evidence of espionage. Indeed, the FBI and naval intelligence repeatedly found none but on a purely racial logic. In his official recommendation, he stated, "The Japanese race is an enemy race, and while many second- and third-generation Japanese born on United States soil, possessed of United States citizenship, have become Americanized, the racial strains are undiluted." He infamously concluded, "A Jap's a Jap. It makes no difference whether he is a high-class, cultivated gentleman or an ignorant rice-field laborer. They are a dangerous element." This was not mere military caution. It was the elevation of racial prejudice to official policy. DeWitt's reports were filled with unsubstantiated fears of shore-to-shore signaling and sabotage, all of which were later debunked. The final report. Japanese evacuation from the West Coast was a masterwork of justification, built on the premise that the very absence of sabotage proved how disciplined the enemy was, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. On the 19th of February 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066. It did not name the Japanese. It simply gave the military broad authority to designate military areas from which any or all persons may be excluded. It was a sanitized, legalistic document that unleashed a human tragedy. For the Nisei, the order was a cataclysm. Gordon Hirabayashi, a student at the University of Washington and a Quaker, found himself in a legal and moral labyrinth. He saw the curfew and exclusion orders as a direct violation of his rights as an American citizen. His diary and legal testimony from the time reflect a profound, agonizing internal conflict. "If I were to register for evacuation, I would be giving passive consent to the classification of myself as a lesser American," he wrote. Hirabayashi chose to turn himself in to the FBI, challenging the order's constitutionality. His stand, and those of Minoru Yasui and Fred Korematsu, formed a lonely resistance. But for the vast majority, there was no choice. The statistical reality of Executive Order 9066 was staggering. It was not a precision strike, it was a logistical hammer that shattered 120,000 lives. Within weeks, families were given days, sometimes hours, to liquidate their entire existence. Businesses, farms, and homes built over decades were sold for pennies on the dollar. The total property loss, estimated at the time at $400 million, would be valued in the billions today. People were tagged like luggage and herded into assembly centers, temporary holding pens at racetracks like Santa Anita, where families were forced to live in horse stalls still rank with the smell of manure. From there, they were shipped inland to 10 hastily constructed relocation centers, bleak, tar paper and barbed wire cities, rising from the dust of America's most desolate landscapes. Manzanar in the California desert, Heart Mountain in Wyoming, Tule Lake. This was the crucible. This was the landscape of betrayal. Life in the camps was a surreal existence, a community of Americans policed by armed American guards in watchtowers. Yet, it was from these very camps that thousands of young men would soon be asked to volunteer to fight for the nation that had imprisoned them. The psychological pressure was immense. The government, having declared them disloyal by action, would now demand they prove their loyalty with blood. This paradox created a fissure within the Japanese-American community, a divide between the no-no boys who refused to serve and those who saw military service as the only possible path back to their American identity. It was from this impossible choice, this cauldron of suspicion and loss, that the 442nd Regimental Combat Team would be born, driven by a motto that perfectly captured their desperate gamble, go for broke. In early 1943, the War Department issued a document that would become a flashpoint for the 120,000 interned Japanese Americans. It was officially titled the Application for Leave Clearance, but it became infamously known as the Loyalty Questionnaire. Every internee over the age of 17 was required to answer its 33 queries. Most were bureaucratic, but 2 questions, 27 and 28, were landmines of profound consequence. Question 27 asked, "Are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty, wherever ordered?" Question 28 asked, "Will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces, and forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese Emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization?" For the Nisei, these questions were a cruel joke, a masterpiece of bureaucratic insult. To answer yes to 27 meant volunteering to die for a country that was currently holding their families prisoner behind barbed wire. To answer yes to 28 meant forswearing an allegiance they had never held, implicitly admitting it had existed. To answer no to both was a logical act of protest against their unjust internment. But the government treated this nuance with a blunt instrument. Those who answered no were branded as disloyal, segregated, and shipped to the high-security Tule Lake camp. Those who answered yes were deemed loyal, yet still, they remained imprisoned. It was from this pool of yes men that the army paradoxically sought to build a new, all-Nisei combat unit. The response was split along a sharp geographical line. In the internment camps on the mainland, the call for 1,500 volunteers was met with a strained, reluctant, yet brave response of just over 1,200 men. But in Hawaii, where the Nisei population had largely been spared mass internment, the call for 1,500 volunteers was met with an explosion of patriotism. Over 10,000 Nisei signed up. Among them was a young man named Daniel Inouye. In his memoirs, Inouye recalled the atmosphere in Honolulu. "I felt that if I, my family, and my friends couldn't prove our loyalty, then we'd be in this concentration camp status for the rest of our lives." The Hawaiian Nisei, known as Buddhaheads, had a different fire. They had not been dispossessed. Their fight was to prove their Americanism was equal to, if not greater than, that of any mainland times, Howell times, white person. When these 10,000 volunteers streamed into the recruitment offices, the army was so overwhelmed it had to send many home. This flood of volunteers was not an accident. It was the result of intense political lobbying. The man at the center was Mike Masaoka, the controversial, pragmatic, and tireless field secretary for the Japanese American Citizens League, JACL. While many in his community despised him for what they saw as collaboration with the government, Masaoka believed in a brutal calculus. He argued that the Nisei had been interned because they were politically powerless and, more importantly, had never made a blood sacrifice for America. Masaoka lobbied Congress and the War Department relentlessly, arguing that the Nisei must be allowed to fight and die. The only way we can prove our loyalty, he argued, is the same way any other American proves it. We must be given the chance to shed our blood. His efforts were instrumental in convincing the War Department to reverse its policy and authorize the creation of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team. The volunteers from Hawaii and the mainland were shipped to Camp Shelby, Mississippi, in the humid, oppressive summer of 1943. The culture clash was immediate. The mainlanders, the Katonks, a Hawaiian slang term, supposedly for the sound their heads made hitting the ground in a fight, or for cotton pickers, were quiet, somber, and carried the trauma of the camps. The Buddhaheads were boisterous, spoke pidgin English, and saw the Katonks as too passive. The tensions were real. Fights were common, but the white officers training them, many from the South, made no distinction. They subjected all of them to the same segregated rules and racial slights as they did African American troops. This shared experience, combined with the brutal Mississippi heat and the shared goal, began to forge a new identity. The training itself was relentless. The army, unsure what to do with them but pressured by Masaoka's promises, trained them for everything. They were pushed through infantry drills, artillery practice, and engineering tasks until they dropped. The goal of the officers was to create a competent fighting unit. The goal of the Nisei was to become time's infallible asterisk. They knew they were under a microscope. Any failure, any mistake, would not be seen as an individual error, but as a reflection on their entire race. They could not just be good, they had to be the best. It was here, in the suffocating humidity of Camp Shelby, that their motto was born, "Go for broke." It was a Hawaiian gambling phrase, meaning to risk everything on a single roll of the dice. For the men of the 442nd, it was not a gamble, it was a statement of intent. They were risking everything, their very lives, for a single desperate wager, that their sacrifice on the battlefields of Europe would buy back their families' freedom and their own honor in America. They were no longer just Buddhaheads or Katonks. They were the 442. While the men of the 442nd were still drilling in the humidity of Mississippi, another Nisei unit was already bleeding in the mud of Europe. This was the 100th Infantry Battalion, separate, a unit formed in June 1942, composed almost entirely of Hawaiian National Guardsmen who had been disarmed and disowned after Pearl Harbor. They were the guinea pigs, sent to war first to test the loyalty of Japanese-American soldiers. On the 22nd of September 1943, the 100th landed at Salerno, Italy, as part of the 34th Red Bull Division. They were thrown immediately into one of the most brutal grinds of the war. The Allied crawl up the mountainous Italian boot against a tenacious, well-entrenched German defence. The terrain was a nightmare, a series of fortified ridges and rain-swollen rivers that the Germans had turned into a fortress. The 100th's baptism by fire came at the Volturno River. This was not the war they had trained for. It was a slow, agonizing fight of attrition. One of the men who exemplified the unit's character was Second Lieutenant Young-Oh Kim. Though of Korean descent, he had chosen to serve with the Nisei. Kim was a brilliant and fearless an officer, known for his aggressive, one-man patrols into German lines. His men, initially suspicious of an officer who wasn't Nisei, came to idolize him. Kim's reports from the Volturno crossing described the sheer hell of it. "We were trying to cross, and the Germans were just waiting for us. Mortar fire, machine guns. It was a meat grinder. The men didn't flinch, they just kept going. They learned in days what takes other units months, the cost of ground, the sound of incoming artillery, and the finality of German potato masher grenades. After breaching the Volturno, the 100th was thrown against the winter defences of the Gothic Line, a chain of fortifications anchored by the ancient monastery of Monte Cassino. Cassino was not just a battle, it was a siege in the mud. The weather was as much an enemy as the Germans. Men lived in foxholes, half filled with freezing water, their feet rotting with trench foot. Artillery was a constant, nerve-shattering presence. It was here the 100th earned its grim nickname. Technical Sergeant Abraham Ohama, a machine gunner, later recalled the psychological toll. "We were shelled, shelled, shelled. You just hugged the ground. You get numb." Some men went Section 8, a discharge for mental breakdown. Others just got quiet. You could see the life go out of their eyes. The 100th was ordered into a series of disastrous assaults, including supporting the 36th Division's catastrophic attempt to cross the Rapido River. The river, fast-flowing and covered by perfectly zeroed-in German machine guns, was a slaughterhouse. The statistics of this campaign are the 100th's dark legacy. The battalion landed at Salerno with approximately 1,300 men. By the time they reached the Anzio beachhead just a few months later, in early 1944, their fighting strength was decimated. In the main assault on Cassino, one company was reduced from over 100 men to just a handful. The casualty rate was astronomical. The battalion had to be reinforced multiple times, yet it was constantly in the line. The sheer volume of wounded led to journalists and other GIs calling them the Purple Heart Battalion. It was not a compliment, it was a simple, brutal description of reality. They were a unit perpetually regenerating and perpetually bleeding. In June 1944, after the fall of Rome, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team finally arrived in Italy from Camp Shelby. They were green, fresh, and eager to prove themselves. They were deployed to a staging area near the 100th Battalion's position. The 442nd was the main unit, the one the army had built. The 100th was supposed to be absorbed into it. But when the officers of the 442nd saw the 100th, they were looking at ghosts. The 100th were veterans, gaunt, quiet, and hardened by a year of war. The 442nd were recruits. A decision was made. The 100th Battalion would become the first battalion of the 442nd, but they refused to give up their name. They had paid for the designation 100th in blood at Salerno, Volturno, and Cassino. The army relented. The unit would be known as the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, but its first battalion would forever be the 100th. The Purple Heart Battalion had survived, and now, combined with the thousands of fresh, ambitious troops from America, their legend was about to be forged in iron. June 1944. The siege of Cassino was broken. Rome had fallen. The war in Italy, for a brief, glorious moment, was no longer a static nightmare of mud and artillery. It was a war of movement. The newly combined 442nd Regimental Combat Team, its green troops from Camp Shelby now fused with the ghostly veterans of the 100th Battalion, was unleashed in a full-throated pursuit of the retreating German army. This was the test. The 100th had proven their loyalty in blood. The 442nd as a whole now had to prove their combined lethality. They were attached to the 34th Red Bull Division, the same division the 100th had served with, and pointed north into the Tuscan hills. The green 442nd troops learned fast, largely because they were led by the survivors of the 100th. The veterans, who had seen the cost of textbook assaults at Cassino, now taught the new men their own brutal calculus. On June 26, near Belvedere, the regiment ran into its first major test. The Germans, from the Wehrmacht's 148th Infantry Division, were dug in on a series of heavily fortified hills, including Hill 140, a key observation post. A conventional, daylight assault would have been suicidal. So, the 100th Battalion, led by men who understood the value of surprise, did the unconventional. Under the cover of darkness, Company B, led by Captain Kim, and Company C, led by Captain Pershing Nakada, scaled the sheer 400-foot cliffs of the hill. They did it in total silence, using hand signals, feeling their way up the rock. When they reached the summit at dawn, they caught the German garrison completely by surprise. The fighting was at point-blank range, a flurry of grenades and submachine gun fire. The Germans, terrified by the sudden, ferocious appearance of the Nisei, broke and ran. This was the first demonstration of what would become their signature tactic. The white officers in the 34th Division were baffled, and the Germans were terrified. The Nisei, small in stature, used speed, stealth, and a seemingly reckless aggression that the Germans mistook for banzai charges. It wasn't a suicidal charge. It was a calculated, overwhelming application of force, a physical manifestation of their go-for-broke motto. They were relentless. For the new men, this was a savage education. A young platoon leader in F Company, 2nd Battalion, named Daniel Inouye, now found himself living the reality he had volunteered for. In his memoirs, he wrote of the surreal nature of this advance. His platoon was ordered to take the town of Castellina. They found themselves in a vicious street-to-street fight. Inouye, leading his men, rounded a corner and came face-to-face with a German machine gun nest. "I remember the fiery, terrifying darts of the tracer bullets," he recalled. "I yelled for my men to take cover, and threw 2 grenades. They landed in the nest, silencing it. He moved forward, rifle ready, and saw the aftermath. It was his first direct kill. Later, in the same chaotic battle, a grenade blast sent shrapnel into his leg. He was bleeding, but he refused evacuation. The drive could not stop. This was the spirit of the 442nd. They advanced when other units would have dug in. They took objectives other units would have shelled. They paid for every yard of ground with personal risk. The statistical result of this 1-month campaign was astonishing, and it silenced every remaining skeptic in the Allied command. From June 26 to the 25th of July 1944, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was a spearhead. They advanced over 100 miles through the rugged Tuscan Apennines. They crossed 3 heavily defended rivers. They liberated 34 separate towns and cities, including the major port of Livorno, which they secured far ahead of schedule. In the process, they inflicted thousands of casualties on the enemy and took several thousand prisoners. Their own casualties were severe, but their pace never slackened. The 34th Division, which had been grinding away in Italy for over a year, suddenly found itself moving at a speed it had never thought possible, all because of the Nisei regiment attached to it. By late July, the 442nd had pushed the Germans all the way to the Arno River, the last natural barrier before the main, formidable Gothic Line. They had proven themselves beyond all doubt. They were not just competent, they were elite. Their go-for-broke philosophy was not a slogan, it was a devastatingly effective tactical doctrine. But just as they prepared to lead the assault on the Gothic Line, the prize they had fought for, they were abruptly pulled from the front. Their reputation had travelled. High Command had a new, more desperate problem in a different country, a place where another American unit had run into a German trap and was facing annihilation. The 442nd, now seen as the Army's premier shock troops, was pulled out of Italy and sent north to France. Their toughest fight was yet to come. In September 1944, the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was pulled from the sun-baked hills and olive groves of Italy. They had been fighting a war of movement, of hard, bright ground and clear skies. They were shipped to the southern coast of France, landing at Marseille, and then loaded onto trains and trucks for a long, cold journey north. Their new battlefield was a place that could not have been more different from the Mediterranean. They were entering the Vosges Mountains, a dense, ancient and dark forest on the border of Germany itself. The men, many of whom had never left Hawaii or California before the war, were now in a landscape from a grim fairy tale. It was a green hell, constantly cold, constantly wet, and claustrophobic in a way they had never experienced. The psychological shift was immediate and brutal. The constant, bone-chilling rain was a miserable backdrop to a new, terrifying form of warfare. Sergeant Ben Tamashiro, a squad leader, wrote about the sheer misery of life in the Vosges. "We were always wet," he recalled. "We never had a chance to dry our clothes. Our feet were always wet. It was miserable. The dense canopy of the 100-foot-tall pines created a perpetual twilight, a disorienting gloom that hid the enemy perfectly. But the true terror of the Vosges was the tree burst. In Italy, soldiers had learned to survive artillery by diving into foxholes. Here, that tactic was a death sentence. German artillery shells were fused to explode on contact with the high branches, creating a downward showering cone of white-hot shrapnel. A foxhole offered no protection. Private First Class Rudy Tokiwa of Company, I described the nightmare. "You feel so helpless. The shrapnel comes down. You can't dig in against it. The men were just being torn to pieces. The forest itself, with its fog and dripping trees, felt like the enemy, amplifying the sounds of unseen mortars and the snap of rifle fire." The 442nd was no longer part of the 34th Red Bull Division. They were now attached to the 36th Texas Division, under the command of Major General John E. Dahlquist. Dahlquist was an ambitious man, a plains general who had performed well in the relatively open country of the Dragoon landings, but he was utterly out of his element in the Vosges. He saw the forest not as a tactical nightmare, but as an obstacle on his map to be crossed off. He was in a hurry to reach the Rhine, and he saw the 442nd, with their ferocious reputation from Italy, as his personal spearhead. He drove them relentlessly, demanding they take objectives that veteran commanders in the region would have deemed suicidal. He pushed them forward with little regard for the terrain, the weather, or the stiffening German resistance. He used them like an expendable tool, a reputation that would come to define his relationship with the Nisei soldiers. The enemy they faced was not the weary Wehrmacht of the Italian retreat. Here, on the doorstep of the fatherland, the 442nd was fighting German Volksgrenadier units. These were often a mix of battle-hardened veterans redeployed from the Eastern Front and young, fanatical conscripts who believed they were defending their homes. They knew this forest, and they had prepared it. The tree burst was not an accident. It was a deliberate tactic. The Germans used highly sensitive impact fuses, like the Zerit fuse, that would detonate on the slightest contact, turning their artillery into an anti-personnel wood chipper. The logistics of this environment were a catastrophe. Jeeps could not move off the few, narrow, muddy tracks that passed for roads. All supplies, ammunition, K-rations and water had to be hand-carried by support troops, often for miles, to the front line. The simple act of casualty evacuation became a horrific ordeal. A man wounded in the morning might not reach an aid station until nightfall, carried by hand in a poncho by 4 comrades who were themselves under fire, slipping and falling in the mud for every yard of progress. The dense canopy made air support impossible. Pilots could not see targets, and the 4T-42ND could not signal them. Dahlquist's first major objective for the 442nd was the town of Bruyères, a critical crossroads. From October 15th, the regiment fought a brutal, house-to-house, 7-day battle to clear the town and the surrounding hills. It was a costly, grinding victory that left the unit exhausted and depleted. They had barely finished counting their dead when General Dahlquist gave them a new set of coordinates. In his haste, he had made a critical mistake. Days earlier, he had ordered the 1st Battalion of the 141st Infantry Regiment, a Texas unit, to advance far ahead of the division's flanks, without support. On the 24th of October 1944, that battalion of 275 men walked straight into a German encirclement. They were cut off, surrounded, and running out of ammunition. The lost battalion was facing annihilation, and Dahlquist knew the only unit on the field capable of the kind of shock assault needed to save them was the 442nd. The 24th of October 1944. The ridge was a narrow, muddy spine of land, barely 1,000 yards long, jutting deep into German-held territory. On it, 275 men of the 1st Battalion, 141st Infantry Regiment, the Texas Regiment, were digging frantically. They were led by Lieutenant Colonel William H. Martin, Jr. Just hours before, they had been the spearhead of the 36th Division. Their commander, General Dahlquist, had ordered them to keep pushing, to seize this high ground, to not let the Germans rest. They had done their job. They had advanced so fast, in fact, that they had outrun their own artillery support, their communications, and, most critically, their flanks. They had pushed themselves onto a peninsula of land, and now the German sea was closing in behind them. The trap was sprung by the German 716th Volksgrenadier Division. These were not the elite SS, but they were determined, fighting on what they considered home soil, and they knew the terrain. They infiltrated the dense, foggy woods on either side of the narrow trail connecting the 1st Battalion to the rest of the 141st Regiment. They set up MG-42 machine guns, Hitler's buzzsaws, in interlocking fields of fire. They zeroed in their mortars. Then they severed the trail. The 1st Battalion was cut off. They were surrounded. They became, in an instant, the Lost Battalion. Their radio, crackling with static and desperation, became their only link. The logs from their forward artillery observer, Lieutenant Marty Higgins, told the grim story. "I'm out of food and water. Medical supplies exhausted. Heavy casualties. Then, more direct. Enemy closing in. Send help." The Germans, tasting victory, began to shell the trapped men relentlessly, using the dreaded tree bursts to inflict maximum carnage on the exposed Texans. Back at the 36th Division headquarters, General Dahlquist was facing a military and political catastrophe. His reckless order had doomed one of his own battalions. The optics were horrendous. A Texas battalion, from his own division, was about to be annihilated. He had already sent the 2nd and 3rd Battalions of the 141st to break through. They had tried. They had attacked the German roadblock and been bloodily repulsed, stalling in the mud and the shrapnel. Dahlquist was out of options, save one. He turned to the commander of the 442nd, Colonel Charles W. Pence. The Nisei Regiment had just been pulled off the line for a promised and desperately needed 3-day rest after the brutal 7-day fight for Bruyères. They were depleted, exhausted, and caked in the cold mud of the Vosges. Dahlquist's order was blunt. "Save them. I don't care how you do it. Just save them." The order was received with stunned silence, then a quiet fury. The executive officer of the 442nd, Lieutenant Colonel Virgil R. Miller, was appalled. The 442nd was already at 50% combat strength. Their companies were hollowed out. They were being asked to turn around, with no rest, no resupply, and attack uphill into a fortified German position that had already stopped 2 fresh American battalions cold. It was a suicide mission. The men of the 442nd, many of whom came from Texas's neighboring state of California, and who had faced a different kind of Texan prejudice in Mississippi, felt the bitter irony. They were being ordered to sacrifice themselves to save the Texas Battalion, the very symbol of the America that had locked up their families. The tactical situation was a nightmare. The Germans didn't just hold the trail, they held the high ground on both sides of it. The 141st was trapped on their ridge, and the 442nd would have to advance up a single, narrow, heavily mined forest path, a perfect kill-sack. The Germans had every inch of that trail pre-sighted. Artillery, mortars, and machine guns were arranged for a slaughter. Any advance would be directly into a wall of interlocking fire and tree bursts. The 275 Texans, running out of everything, had become the bait in a trap, and the 442nd was being ordered to walk directly into it. There was no finesse, no clever flanking maneuver possible in this terrain. The only way to the Lost Battalion was straight through the German line. It would be a battle of attrition, yard by painful yard. The men of the 442nd, their faces grey with fatigue, picked up their rifles, fixed their bayonets, and turned back into the green hell of the Vosges. The 27th of October 1944. The attack began at 1,100 hours, not with a bang, but with a miserable, sodden push into the fog. The rain was incessant, a cold, driving sheet that turned the forest floor into a swamp of mud and pine needles. The sound of warfare in the Vosges was uniquely terrible. The snap times of German Mausers, the high-velocity rip of the MG-42S, and the constant, dreaded times, whoosh, crack times of tree-bursting mortars. The 442nd, already exhausted, was ordered to attack an enemy they could not see. The 100th and 2nd Battalions were tasked with fixing the German flanks, a bloody, attritional job of absorbing bullets. The main effort, the suicidal task, was given to the 3rd Battalion, a frontal assault straight up the narrow, heavily defended ridge to reach the lost battalion. The advance was a meat grinder from the first yard. The Germans had spent days preparing this kill zone. The Nisei, moving forward in a staggered rush, were cut down by pre-sighted machine guns. The attack stalled almost immediately. The men of the 3rd Battalion were pinned, forced to hug the slick, cold earth as shrapnel and bullets rained down from the canopy. It was in this moment of lethal stalemate that the go-for-broke spirit manifested not as a grand strategy, but as a series of individual, desperate acts of courage. In Company I, Private First Class Barney Hajiro, a quiet man from Hawaii, saw his squad, and the entire attack, pinned by a machine gun nest. He did the unthinkable. He stood up, and in full view of the enemy, began walking times toward times the German line, firing his Browning automatic rifle from the hip. He was deliberately making himself the only target. He drew the fire of 2 separate machine gun nests. While the Germans were focused on this single, seemingly insane Nisei, Hajiro's squad was able to maneuver and destroy one of the nests. Hajiro himself miraculously reached a second nest, which he single-handedly destroyed with rifle grenades. His action broke the stalemate on his flank. Further up the ridge, the attack stalled again, this time just 500 yards from the lost battalion's perimeter. The Germans were dug in on a small, steep hill that commanded the entire trail. They had machine guns, mortars, and a fanatical will to hold. This was Suicide Hill. The 3rd Battalion's I and K companies were ordered to take it. What happened next was not in any U.S. Army field manual. The men, out of ammunition in some cases, driven by a fury born of days of frustration and loss, fixed their bayonets. Lieutenant Robert Foote, a white officer in K Company, later recalled the moment. There was no order. The men just got up, they rose as one, and just started running uphill, screaming. Private Matsuji Mut Sakumoto of I Company was in that charge. He described it as a moment of pure, terrifying clarity. We were screaming. We were yelling. It was a banzai charge. The Nisei, in a wave of terrifying, high-pitched yells, surged up the muddy slope, firing from the hip and plunging their bayonets into the German foxholes. The German defenders, many of them veterans, had never seen anything like it. They were so terrified by the ferocity of this banzai charge that they broke, abandoned their machine guns, and fled. This was the climax. The 442nd had advanced just 1.5 miles in 5 days of relentless, brutal combat. The cost was staggering. Each yard was paid for in blood. The density of fire was unlike anything they had faced, including Cassino, but the German line was shattered. On the ridge, the trapped men of the 141st heard the shooting approaching. Then they heard the screaming. They grabbed their rifles, thinking it was a final German assault. Lieutenant Marty Higgins, the artillery observer, peered through the fog and the trees. He saw small, mud-caked figures, running. He grabbed his radio. His voice, breaking with emotion, crackled over the division net. Nisei troops are in sight. They're coming. My God, they are a beautiful sight. On October 30, at 1,500 hours, The first soldiers of the 442nd, from the shattered I and K companies, broke through the perimeter and reached the 211 surviving Texans. The scene was one of stunned, surreal silence. The Texans, gaunt, bearded, and hollow-eyed from 6 days of siege, stared at their rescuers. They saw men smaller than them, exhausted, covered in mud and blood, and Japanese-American. One Texan, stumbling forward, reportedly put his hand on a Nisei soldier's shoulder and said, "I don't know who you are, but I'm glad to see you." The battle was won. But as the Nisei soldiers, who had just lost hundreds of their own men, looked at the 211 soldiers they had saved, the true, agonizing cost of the rescue was just beginning to be counted. When the shooting stopped, the silence on the ridge was heavier and more terrifying than the artillery. It was a cold, wet quiet, broken only by the moans of the wounded and the calm, methodical voices of the medics. Men like Masaoka Yamada, a medic with the 100th Battalion, moved from body to body in the fog, performing a grim triage. The survivors of the 3rd Battalion, those few who had made the final charge, simply sat on the muddy ground, their faces blank, their rifles hanging loosely in their hands. They were surrounded by the dead, both their own and the enemy's. When the 211 surviving Texans, gaunt and stunned, walked over to thank them, there was no celebration. There were just quiet handshakes and a shared, hollow-eyed stare. Into this scene of exhaustion and carnage came the 36th Division's commander, Major General John E. Dahlquist. He arrived with his aides, pleased with the victory. He intended to congratulate the Nisei for their spectacular success. But he was not met with cheers. He was met with a wall of stony, accusatory silence. The Nisei survivors, caked in blood and mud, just stared at him. They did not stand. They did not salute. They just looked at the man who had ordered them into the meat grinder. The general, nonplussed by the reception, quickly cut his visit short. This was not a moment for congratulations. It was a moment of profound, bottomless loss, and the men who had paid the price knew exactly who had written the check. The true, agonizing cost of the rescue was tallied not by commanders, but by the chaplains. Chaplain Hiro Higuchi and Chaplain Masao Yamada of the 442nd were faced with an impossible task. The dead were everywhere, shattered by the tree bursts and point-blank machine gun fire. Identification was a nightmare. Higuchi later wrote of the horror of trying to identify men who were literally in pieces, of finding a familiar name on a scrap of uniform or a helmet we had to hold services for. A helmet, a rifle, and a pair of boots, Higuchi recalled, because there was nothing else. They worked relentlessly, trying to give each man a proper burial, writing hundreds of letters home to families in Hawaii, and most cruelly, to families still imprisoned in internment camps like Manzanar and Heart Mountain. How could they explain, in a letter, that their son had died to rescue men from Texas, a state that often enforced segregation against them? The white officers who had served with the 442nd were forever changed. Lieutenant Robert Foote, who had witnessed the Banzai charge of K Company, was overcome with a profound sense of awe and guilt. He knew he had witnessed a kind of courage that defied all logic. The rescued Texans were equally stunned. Lieutenant Marty Higgins, the man whose radio calls had pleaded for help, felt a debt that could never be repaid. The men of the 141st, on their release, were so grateful they took up a collection among themselves to try and do something for their rescuers, but it was a futile gesture in the face of the sacrifice. The most infamous and perhaps apocryphal story of the aftermath illustrates the disconnect. Days later, General Dahlquist, in an attempt to publicly honor the regiment, allegedly ordered Colonel Pence to assemble the 442nd for a review. Colonel Pence, or perhaps his executive officer Virgil Miller, looked at the general and replied with a quiet, steely rage, "Sir, I can't. They're not all here. The men are too weary, and they are too few." When Dahlquist insisted, the order was given. The entire 442nd Regimental Combat Team assembled. When Dahlquist asked where the rest of the men were, he was told, "Sir, this is all that's left." The statistics of the Lost Battalion rescue are the regiment's most sacred and most brutal testament. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, in just 5 days of fighting from October 26th to October 30th, suffered over 800 casualties. This number is a cold abstraction. The reality was in the rifle companies, the tip of the spear. To rescue 211 Texans, the 3rd Battalion was effectively annihilated. Company I, which had begun the push with 185 riflemen, had only 8 men left who were able to walk off the line. Company K, which had also started with nearly 190 men, was reduced to just 17. The 100th Battalion, which had supported the assault, suffered over 100 casualties. The 2nd Battalion suffered nearly as many. The entire regiment, which had entered the Vosges Mountains as a full-strength unit of over 3,000 men, was now combat ineffective. The battle was not a victory, it was a sacrifice. The nickname Purple Heart Battalion, earned by the 100th in the grinding hell of Cassino, now belonged to the entire 442nd. They had saved the lost battalion, but in doing so they had been destroyed. Their legend was cemented, but it was a legend written in blood, posing a dark and eternal question. What kind of nation demands this level of sacrifice from the very sons it has imprisoned? In November 1944, what was left of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team was pulled out of the Vosges Mountains. They were not a unit, they were a collection of survivors, a skeletal framework of a regiment. They were shipped south, away from the front, to the maritime Alps region of southern France, near the Italian border. This new assignment was so comparatively safe and quiet that the men grimly nicknamed it the Champagne Campaign. The contrast was a form of psychological torture. Days before, they had been in a literal green hell, fighting for every yard of mud, watching their friends get shredded by tree bursts. Now, they were quartered in comfortable towns on the French Riviera, looking at the placid, blue Mediterranean. But the men were not there. They were ghosts, haunted by the forests, and the quiet was, in its own way, as deafening as the artillery. The true war for the 442nd in this period was not against the Germans, but against their own minds. The 1,000-yard stare was the uniform of the day. The medics and surgeons, who had worked in a non-stop butcher's shop for weeks, now had to deal with the invisible wounds. Dr. Katsumi Komatani, a regimental surgeon, saw men who were physically whole but mentally shattered. They suffered from severe combat fatigue, what we now call post-traumatic stress disorder. Men would dive for cover at the sound of a truck backfiring. They were quiet, withdrawn, and prone to sudden, uncontrollable tremors. The sheer volume of non-combat casualties, like trench foot and frostbite, from the Vosges was staggering, but it was the psychological damage that was most profound. These were men who had been pushed so far past the breaking point that they no longer knew how to be at peace. The irony of their situation was a bitter one. In this rearguard area, they encountered French civilians for the first time as liberators. The French, who had been under German occupation, treated the Nisei with a gratitude and warmth that was completely disarming. They saw the 442nd not as Japs, but as Americans, as their saviors. They were invited into homes, offered wine and food, and celebrated as heroes. This was a profound shock to men who had only known suspicion from their own countrymen. Yet, this warmth was contrasted by the official U.S. Army policy. When the Nisei soldiers went into nearby towns on leave, they often found that the recreation canteens and clubs run by the Red Cross were segregated. They would be directed, alongside African-American troops, to the colored facilities, while white soldiers, including the very Texans they had just rescued, used the main clubs. They were heroes to the French, but still second-class citizens to their own army. It was here, in the quiet of southern France, that the numbers were finally tallied, and the true meaning of the Purple Heart Battalion became a statistical fact. The 442nd Regimental Combat Team, including the 100th Battalion, had a total official roster of about 4,000 men. Over the course of the war, due to replacements, about 14,000 men served in the unit at one time or another. In less than 2 years of combat, the unit suffered 9,486 Purple Hearts. This was a casualty rate of 314%. It meant that, on average, every man in the unit had been wounded more than 3 times. Some men were on their 4th or 5th Purple Heart. The regiment was awarded 21 Medals of Honor, the vast majority of which were upgraded from lesser medals decades later, a correction for the racial prejudice that had denied them at the time. They received 52 Distinguished Service Crosses, over 560 Silver Stars, and thousands of Bronze Stars. For its size and length of service, the 442nd was, without question, the most decorated unit in the history of the United States. This Champagne campaign was a brief respite, a time to count the dead and absorb the new, green replacements fresh-faced Nisei, many of them just 18 years old, arriving from the internment camps to fill the ranks of the shattered companies. The veterans, hollow-eyed and quiet, looked at these new kids with a mixture of pity and resentment. They knew what was coming. In March 1945, the call came. The war in Europe was in its final, dying phase, but one sector of the front in Italy remained stubbornly locked, the Gothic Line. This was the same line the 442nd had been pulled away from months before. The Allies had been pounding against it for a year, a seemingly unbreakable wall of German fortifications. High Command had one last, impossible task, and they knew only one unit had the reputation for doing the impossible. The 442nd, partially refitted but still spiritually broken, was ordered back to Italy. Their rest was over. April 1945. Italy. The 442nd was back where they had started, but they were not the same men. They were now attached to the 92nd Infantry Division, the Buffalo Soldiers, another segregated unit composed of African-American soldiers. The irony was lost on no one. America's 2 most segregated units were being thrown against the single most fortified German position in Italy. This was the western end of the Gothic Line, a seemingly impenetrable wall of mountains Monte Folgorito, Monte Carcio, Monte Belvedere, that the Germans had spent a year reinforcing. Allied command, after months of bloody, failed frontal assaults by other divisions, had deemed it unbreakable by conventional means. The Germans, sitting in concrete and steel bunkers with interlocking fields of fire, agreed. The new commander of the 442nd was Colonel Virgil R. Miller, the man who had been the executive officer during the Vosges nightmare. He knew his men. He knew they were not a blunt instrument to be thrown away in another frontal assault. He also knew they were the only unit capable of what he was about to propose. Miller, along with his officers, devised a plan of such audacious risk that any other commander would have dismissed it as insane. The Germans expected an attack from the front, up the heavily mined and defended valleys. They did not, and could not, expect an attack from the sheer, 3,000-foot vertical cliffs on their flank. Miller's plan, part of Operation Craftsman, was simple. The 442nd would do what was considered impossible. Under the cover of total darkness, they would scale the rock faces of Monte Folgorito, hand over hand, in complete silence, and appear on the German flank at dawn. The night of the 4th of April 1945 was a symphony of terror and discipline. The men of the 3rd Battalion, their faces blackened with burnt cork, began the ascent. They were loaded with full combat gear, ammunition, and rifles. They climbed in total silence, using only hand signals. A single loose rock, a single metallic click of a canteen, would doom the entire operation. For 8 agonizing hours they climbed, feeling for handholds in the dark, their fingers bleeding, their lungs burning in the thin mountain air. Below them was a 3,000-foot drop. Above them, unsuspecting, was the German army. Among the men in this assault was Lieutenant Daniel Inouye. His platoon, like the rest, reached the summit just before dawn, exhausted but undiscovered. As the sun broke, the 442nd Artillery unleashed a barrage on the German positions, a signal for the assault. Inouye and his men rose from the rocks and charged. The Germans were in a state of total, complete shock. They had been attacked from a direction they thought was guarded by God and gravity. But this was not an easy fight. It was a desperate, point-blank brawl on the mountaintop. It was here that Daniel Inouye's go-for-broke spirit became legend. As he led his platoon against a series of 3 German MG-42 machine gun nests, he was shot in the stomach by a sniper. He ignored the wound, kept charging, and took out the first nest with a grenade. As he prepared to throw a grenade at the second, a German rifle grenade struck his right elbow, severing his arm almost completely. He was a 20-year-old man, bleeding to death, his right arm hanging by a few threads of skin. Yet, as his stunned platoon watched, Inouye calmly, agonizingly, prized the live grenade from his useless right hand with his good left hand, stood up and threw it, destroying the second bunker. He then continued to advance, firing his submachine gun with his left hand until a bullet shattered his leg. He fell, but continued to yell at his men, "Go! Get them!" He would not allow evacuation until his platoon had secured the ridge. His arm was later amputated. This was the spirit of the 442nd, and it was industrial in its effect. The unbreakable Gothic Line, which had held the entire Allied Fifth Army at bay for a year, was shattered by the Nisei in less than 32 minutes. The Germans, believing they were being attacked by a force of overwhelming numbers, not a single, audacious regiment panicked. The 442nd's breakthrough was not just a hole, it was a floodgate. They didn't just take the ridge, they unhinged the entire German defensive line in Italy. In the following days, the 442nd, in a war of rapid movement reminiscent of their first days in Italy, chased the collapsing German army north, liberating town after town, advancing miles per day, and taking thousands of prisoners. The assault on the Gothic Line was the 442nd's tactical masterpiece. It was not a battle of attrition like the Vosges. It was a battle of pure, calculated audacity, a perfect go-for-broke maneuver that traded on their unique discipline, skill, and willingness to do the impossible. In one single, brilliant, and costly stroke, they had effectively ended the war in Italy. The German army in Italy would sign an unconditional surrender just weeks later, but as the 442nd advanced north, into the final chaos of the collapsing Third Reich, one final, dark discovery awaited them. Late April 1945. The war in Italy was over, won by the 442nd's audacious final charge. But the regiment, like many units in the chaotic collapse of the Third Reich, had been split. Its core infantry battalions were mopping up in Italy, but one of its key components, the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, had been detached months earlier. The 522nd, with its powerful 105mm howitzers, had been loaned to the US 7th Army and was now pushing deep into southern Germany itself. They were moving fast, part of a spearhead cutting through Bavaria, often outrunning their own intelligence. They were artillerymen, used to firing at coordinates on a map, but they were about to stumble upon a target that had never been on any map, a place of unimaginable horror. The men of the 522nd were following rumours, a strange, horrific smell on the wind, and a trail of human debris. On the 29th of April 1945, near the town of Landsberg am Lech, they began to encounter them. Long, straggling columns of skeletal figures in striped pyjamas, staggering aimlessly down the roads. These were the survivors of a death march, prisoners from the Koffering camp complex, who had been abandoned by their fleeing SS guards. Technician 5th grade Ichiro Inouye, an artilleryman, was one of the first to see them. He described the profound, uncomprehending shock. They were walking skeletons, he recalled. They were just bones. Many were so weak they fell down. We didn't know what they were. We had never heard of concentration camps. The Nisei soldiers, acting on instinct, stopped their trucks and began pulling out their own K-rations, offering them to the starving figures. The prisoners, seeing the Japanese faces on their liberators, were equally bewildered, many bursting into tears. This was only the prelude. Following the trail of the marchers, the 522nd's forward observers pushed on and came upon the source. It was Kaufering 4, one of the largest subcamps of the Dachau concentration camp complex. The SS had fled, but not before setting the barracks on fire, attempting to burn the evidence and the remaining prisoners alive. Private First Class Hideo Brownie E. Nakamine was there. The sights, sounds, and smells seared themselves into his memory. The stench was overwhelming. We saw these structures, half buried, like animal pens, he described in a post-war interview. Then we saw the bodies. They were piled like cordwood, piles and piles of them, and there were the living. They were not people. They were shadows, crying, crawling. The Nisei soldiers, hardened by Cassino, the Vosges, and the Gothic Line, men who had seen their friends blown to pieces, were utterly broken by the sight. They vomited. They wept. They instinctively tried to help, to pull people from the burning, typhus-ridden huts, to offer what little food they had. The statistical reality of the moment was a moral sledgehammer, a piece of historical irony so profound, so bitter, that it defies articulation. Here were the Nisei, soldiers of the 522nd, men who had volunteered to fight for America while their own mothers, fathers, brothers, and sisters were, at that very moment, still living as prisoners behind the barbed wire of American relocation centers. The U.S. government, in its fear, had branded the Japanese Americans as disloyal and interned them in concentration camps, a term Roosevelt himself had used. Now, these same soldiers were the liberators of a German concentration camp, a place that represented the final, logical, and industrial-scale conclusion of the exact same racial hysteria that had imprisoned their own families. The Nisei, who had been fighting to prove they were loyal Americans, were now face to face with the ultimate victims of a state that demanded racial purity. The encounter was surreal, a dark mirror. The Jewish survivors, seeing their Japanese-American liberators, saw a shared humanity. The Nisei soldiers, looking at the prisoners, saw not only a tragedy, but a terrifying echo of the prejudice that had defined their entire lives. The 522nd's role in this liberation was almost immediately and deliberately obscured. They were an artillery battalion, and they were not supposed to be there, so far ahead of the infantry. When the main American infantry units, like the 45th Thunderbird Division, arrived later, they officially liberated the camp and took control. The Nisei were ordered to move on, to continue the pursuit. Their discovery, their act of liberation, was classified, buried in after-action reports, and denied by the army for decades. The men of the 522nd were told not to speak of what they had seen. They carried this secret home, a final, haunting burden. They had concluded their war not with a parade, but with a silent, secret act of liberation, a final testament to the paradox of their service. They were men deemed unfit for freedom, who had in turn given freedom back to the world. The war was over. In 1945 and 1946, the men of the 442nd Regimental Combat Team, those who had survived, began the long journey home. They were no longer the green, naive volunteers from Hawaii or the somber, resentful internees from the mainland camps. They were veterans, hardened by the worst fighting the European theatre had seen. They were, on paper, heroes. On the 15th of July 1946, the regiment was assembled on the White House lawn, standing in formation before President Harry S. Truman. The air was thick with the sense of history. Truman, attaching the final Presidential Distinguished Unit citation to their regimental colours, stepped to the microphone and delivered a speech that would become as much a part of their legacy as their battles. "I can't tell you how much I appreciate the privilege of being able to show you how much the United States of America thinks of what you have done," Truman said, his voice carrying over the ellipse. He looked at the Nisei soldiers, men still bearing the scars of the Vosges and the Gothic Line. "You have fought for the free nations of the world. You fought not only the enemy, but you fought prejudice, and you won." His words were a powerful, official, and unequivocal validation from the highest office in the land. He was telling them, and the nation, that their gamble had paid off, that their blood sacrifice had purchased not only victory over the Axis, but victory over the racial hysteria that had imprisoned them. It was a perfect cinematic ending, but it was not the truth. It was a political hope, not a social reality. As the men left the adulation of Washington, D.C., and returned to their homes, particularly on the West Coast, they found Truman's words were just words. The prejudice they had fought had not been defeated. It had been waiting for them. Daniel Inouye, his right arm amputated, his uniform adorned with medals for his heroism on the Gothic Line, was one of the first to experience this dual reality. On his way home, he walked into a barber shop in San Francisco, still in his decorated uniform. The barber looked up, saw his face, and said, "We don't serve Japs here." Inouye, stunned, simply walked out. This was the America they had returned to. All over California, Washington, and Oregon, returning Nisei veterans were refused service in restaurants, denied jobs, and met with signs that read, "No Japs allowed" or "Japs go home." The families they had fought to liberate were themselves still prisoners. While the war in Europe ended in May 1945, the internment camps in America did not officially close until 1946. Many of the soldiers returned not to welcoming homes, but to barracks in desolate relocation centers, to families who had lost everything. The statistical hammer of their homecoming was not one of battlefield casualties, but of economic devastation. Upon release from the camps, each internee was given a train ticket and $25. This was the resettlement money for a family who had lost their farm, their business, their home, and 4 years of their lives. The total property loss was estimated in 1D42 at $400 million, a figure that would be in the billions today. The 1948 Japanese-American Evacuation Claims Act, which was meant to provide compensation, was a bureaucratic insult. It paid out only 10 cents on the dollar for documented losses, and it explicitly did not cover lost income or potential. For most, the losses were total and permanent. This was the bitter homecoming. The soldiers had faced down the Wehrmacht, but now they faced anti-Japanese organizations like the Remember Pearl Harbor League and the Pacific Coast Japanese Problem League. These groups actively lobbied to prevent the Nisei from returning to their homes, spreading the same racial poison that DeWitt had used to intern them. The men of the 442nd, the most decorated unit in American history, had to fight for the simple right to buy a house in their old neighborhood. Their go-for-broke sacrifice had not, as Truman claimed, won the war against prejudice. It had simply been a down payment. It had earned them a seat at the table. But the realization was profound and bitter. The war in Europe was over, but the fight for their rights, for true equality, for the very soul of America, was just beginning. This new war would not be fought with bayonets and grenades, but in courtrooms, in Congress, and in the quiet, daily struggle for dignity for the next 40 years. The battlefield had changed, but the war continued. The 1,980 seconds. The enemy was no longer the Wehrmacht, but the fading, painful memory of an America that had failed its own ideals. The fight was now waged in the halls of Congress, and its objective was not a piece of ground, but a piece of the national conscience. This was the final campaign of the 442nd, the fight for redress. In 1980, Congress established the Commission on Wartime Relocation and Internment of Civilians, the CWRIC. Its mandate was simple: to investigate the facts surrounding Executive Order 9066 and to recommend appropriate remedies. For the first time, the men who had been interned and the soldiers who had fought were given an official forum to tell their story, not as a plea, but as a demand for the historical record. This fight was led, fittingly, by the veterans themselves. They had traded their blood-stained uniforms for the dark suits of American politics, and in doing so, they had become the very power structure they had once been subject to. Daniel Inouye, who had lost his arm on the Gothic Line, was now a powerful, revered United States Senator from Hawaii. His colleague, Spark Matsunaga, another 442nd veteran, served alongside him in the Senate. In the House of Representatives, Norman Mineta, who had been interned as a boy at Hart Mountain, was a rising leader. They were not just politicians. They were living, breathing testaments to the paradox. They used their unimpeachable records, their medals, their scars, as a form of political and moral currency. In speech after speech, they dismantled the old arguments of military necessity. Senator Inouye, in a famous thundering speech, once responded to a colleague who questioned Nisei loyalty by quietly, icily, detailing the exact circumstances under which he lost his arm. The silence that followed was a form of surrender. The CWRIC hearings were a national exorcism, a moment of profound, painful, and necessary testimony. Nisei veterans, now in their 60 broke down in public, weeping as they recalled the moment they heard their families were interned. Men who had charged machine gun nests in the Vosges admitted, their voices breaking, that the deepest wound they had ever received was not from a German bullet, but from their own government. They spoke of the bitter irony of liberating Dachau while their own parents were prisoners. They were countered by opposition groups, like those led by Lillian Baker, who argued that the camps were not concentration camps, that they were protective and necessary, and that any apology or payment would be a betrayal of the American soldiers who fought in the Pacific. But the testimony of the 442nd, of the internees, was too powerful. It was primary evidence, not of espionage, but of a profound, devastating, and racially motivated failure of American democracy. In 1983, the CWRIC issued its final report, titled Personal Justice Denied. Its conclusion was unequivocal. Executive Order 9066 was not a military necessity. It was, the report stated, a grave injustice that was conceived in wartime hysteria and perpetuated by racial prejudice, a failure of political leadership, and a lack of critical thought. The Commission recommended an official, presidential apology and a symbolic, individual payment of $20,000 to each of the approximately 60,000 surviving internees. This was the Civil Liberties Act, and it became the 442nd's final objective. The legislative fight was brutal, lasting for years, but the veterans, led by Inouye and Matsunaga, never relented. They lobbied their colleagues, they attached the bill to other legislation, they called in every favor. It was their final campaign. In 1988, the bill passed Congress. On the 10th of August 1988, President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act into law. At the signing ceremony, he invoked the 442nd, stating, "Here, we admit a wrong. Here, we reaffirm our commitment as a nation to equal justice under the law." This was the bookend. This was the payoff. The saga of the 442nd Regiment was never just a tale of battlefield valor. It was the central paradox of America's Second World War. It was the story of how a group of men, dispossessed, interned, and stripped of their rights, had responded not with righteous fury, but with a disciplined, desperate courage. They had made a 40-year-long wager, a true go-for-broke gamble, that their blood, their sacrifice, and their unwavering faith in the Times idea, Times of America, even as its Times reality Times betrayed them, would one day be enough. With this act of redress, that gamble had finally, fully, and painfully paid off. They had not just won their battles in Italy and France, they had won their war in Washington. They had forced their nation, the nation that had branded them as misfits and enemy aliens, to look them in the eye, acknowledge its own profound sin, and, in an act of redemptive justice, finally, officially, call them what they had been all along, heroes.